Welcome to our 9-lesson series called Pulling G's, where we'll study fighter pilot perspectives on faith. My name is Hugh Vest, my call sign is Huge, and I'm a retired fighter pilot with over 4,000 hours. I'll be your guide or your instructor pilot for this journey. So strap inside a $40 million F-16 Viper and come with me for an insider's look at the tactics, training, and technology behind 21st century aerial combat. This study will take a warrior's perspective on faith that'll hopefully inspire you in spiritual combat with the same things, the same tools that make for a leading-edge fighter pilot. Each chapter in this series will start with real cockpit insights, and from there we'll move on to everyday life faith applications, and we'll end with debrief questions for you or your group to look at. So some things we'll talk about is we'll debrief your life's mission like a fighter pilot. We'll strain on the G-forces of this world. We'll study the tactics of our adversary. We'll learn to trust our instrument in faith. We'll also learn to know our -1 checklist for life. We'll see through the black world using our Creator's night vision goggles. We'll explore the call signs of God. And then we'll also look at hangar flying lessons in faith from some of the pioneers out there. So again, as fighter pilots would say, fights on. So before we get into the series and are in chapter 1 and press on with all the other chapters, I'd like to do what we call some administrative details, or admin as fighter pilots call it. So a couple things. First thing is I'd like it, if you get a chance, to take a look at the book, Pulling G's, Fighter Pilot Perspectives in Faith. And I'm the author, Hugh Vest. And this book actually has more chapters in it. It has all the lessons in it, but additional details. And then the good thing is it's also a short read. So I just encourage you to pick it up. It's available on crosslinkpublishing.com. Or if you want to talk to your local Christian bookstore, it's available through the Ingram Distribution Network. And so I'd like to encourage you there to pick up the book if you can. A couple other things is I'd like to thank the Air Force for the chance to do this. And they actually were able to review the material in the book, in which I'll be presenting here, and then found that it's within Air Force policy. And I do have to remind you that none of the views that I'll talk about here represent the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force. So I have to offer that disclaimer. And additionally, there is no classified or sensitive data in any of these. And then finally, I'd like to thank YouTube for giving me this free opportunity to pass on these lessons to you, for you to look at and hopefully enjoy and join me in this journey. So again, welcome. Join me in this journey, and we'll get into chapter 1 and following on chapters here. So fights on. Welcome to Chapter 7 of the Pulling G's video series. If you haven't had a chance to check out chapters 1 through 6, I'd encourage you to do so. But if not, if this is the first time you're joining us, then welcome. One quick note, all these videos actually are taken during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's kind of the reason I'm trying to embed as many videos as I can, but this particular format for talking about the different chapters is being driven by kind of that. So welcome again. Today we're talking about your crew chief. The verse we picked out today, the verse I picked out for this discussion is Romans, the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the church in Rome, chapter 1, verses 12. And it says that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. So for fighters, for most fighters, there is actually one cockpit, one position for a pilot, except for some training versions. But you really, even though there's one position there, you never go it alone. Behind the pilot, behind that flight, behind what we call a sortie, one flight in an aircraft, there's a cast of unsung heroes behind that, doing their part. They're toiling behind the scenes to make that happen. And I'll mention some of these in just a second here. But a single sortie, a single flight in an F-16 or whatever fighter is actually a kind of a symphony of all these folks and their specialty codes coming together. So it's an interesting thing. So I'll list some of these different professionals, and it's amazing when you think of it. I put together a list, but this is just some that I could think of. Obviously, there are many more, but I didn't include every one of them. So computer technicians, they ensure the mission planning software is loaded and the brief systems run smoothly. Administrative experts verify the pilot currencies, flight plans, and they check out the video mission recorders. Intelligence teams actually brief the critical mission threats and adversary tactics. Life support professionals actually prep pilot flight gear and our survival equipment. Security forces, they actually protect the base, the aircraft, and the flight line. Fuel system specialists transport and pump the thousands of gallons of fuel that's the lifeblood of fighter aviation. Aircraft schedulers ensure there are enough jets each turn to meet the mission, and range schedulers actually deconflict critical range airspace utilization times. Ammo troops, ammunition or ammo troops actually build the weapons and harden shelters and transport and load them on the aircraft. Logistics airmen keep the supply line of parts rolling to the maintainers. Backshop personnel endlessly labor repairing broken engines, boxes, avionics boxes, and pods taken off of jets. Depot and phase maintainers install upgrades and overhaul and inspect jets at an amazing pace. Airfield management cadre, they actually clear the runways, the taxiways, and guarantee the navigation aids, emergency cables and barriers on the runway, and approach lights are functional. Fire and medical personnel actually constantly train, and they keep vigilant, responding to any real or even potential emergency. Air traffic control professionals orchestrate the flow of jets in and out of the airfield and onto the ranges. Range troops actually build training targets. They score weapons deliveries for us, and they monitor safety procedures. Explosive ordnance demolition teams, those guys gather and destroy unexploded range munitions. And these are just a few. Like I said, there's a whole host of others. So you can see how many people, how many specialists, how many folks behind the scenes are working together to launch one flight. Now there's one person or one group of people that I haven't mentioned, and this is someone that the pilot interacts with every day. Is kind of the face of all these folks working behind the scenes, and that's the pilot's crew chief. So the pilot may actually rent, is kind of the words we use for it, renting the jet for a day, but the crew chief is the one who kind of owns it. So there are really two names actually painted on a fighter. Usually they'll have one name for the pilot, whose aircraft that is, but then even more important really is the name of that crew chief who owns that jet. So, crew chiefs have their names painted on a jet for a very good reason. They kind of own that jet. It's their responsibility to take care of it. And they work in a very hazardous environment, as some of those other professionals do. They can work in up to minus 30 degrees up on the flight line to where that concrete heats up to 120 plus in desert kind of concrete ramps. These aircraft they're working near are sometimes loaded with over 4,500 pounds of explosives, 13,000 pounds of gas, 500 rounds, possibly of 20 Mike bullets, and then flares. So it's a very hazardous environment. and to the Navy, our Navy bros too. Those guys, you combine all of that in a small space, an aircraft carrier, and it's even more interesting, and it's amazing what they do. So I thought I'd show a quick video. This gives a great example of what a basic job of a crew chief is. And this is a video of a Singapore crew chief, and I think he does an excellent job talking about kind of what that role is. So I'll go ahead and show the video.
I am First Sergeant Darren Batchelor, and I'm a dedicated crew chief. I belong to 145 Squadron. We operate the F-16s. The F-16 is one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft, and it is on the front line of Singapore's air defense. But like any sophisticated machine, it needs to be maintained and serviced so it can operate at its highest stage. There are two sets of technicians that work on the F-16. The base or second line technicians are specialists. For example, a base technician might be specialized in electronics. The squadron or first line technicians are responsible for inspecting the aircraft before and after every flight. We are called dedicated crew chiefs because we are assigned only one aircraft a day to inspect. This ensures I am totally focused on the safety of that one plane. There are three kinds of inspections that we conduct: the pre-flight inspection, post-flight inspection, and the through-flight inspection. The through-flight inspection is for an aircraft that is scheduled to fly more than once, so we inspect the aircraft between flights. Although we follow a detailed checklist, we have to be very focused and meticulous. In a typical pre-flight inspection, there are about 100 line items to check for. Not everything in the checklist is in black and white, like whether a screw is loose or not. So that's why it takes a little experience and a keen eye to actually judge whether something is wrong or missing. If I do find something, I simply ground the plane. Then the second line specialists are actually called in for further evaluation. Each time I ground the plane, there are no questions asked. Safety of the pilot and the aircraft is paramount. Besides, when you think of how densely populated Singapore is and how catastrophic a crash could be, there is no room for error. The flight crew and ground crew must work seamlessly together. The bottom line is that without us, the pilots won't be flying, and without pilots, there won't be any need for ground crew. It's that understanding that keeps the flying squadron tight. It can be a little stressful because you know that a lot rests on your shoulders, so you must give 100% attention. But sometimes when I'm out in the public and I see the faces of people when an RSAF fighter flies overhead, to see the pride and wonder on their faces, it's good to be reminded why I do what I do. I'm First Sergeant Darren Batchelor, and I'm an airman.
So that was a great video, I think, of showing what crew chiefs actually do. And I can say in over 4,000 hours of flying Air Force jets that crew chiefs and the other guys sweating and working behind the scenes, those warriors all have my back. I was blessed to have all my takeoffs equal the number of landings, which is a good thing. And have flown safely in the jets that I rented from these guys. And I do appreciate it. I was able to do the mission as a fighter pilot that I did because of what they do and their service. And I'll never forget in all my flying experiences that all their sweat actually made that possible. And that's what made it possible. So in our mission for Christ, very similar to our mission like flying fighters, we do have and we're supported by crew chiefs, this cast of thousands and countless brothers and sisters who labor behind the scenes. So our mission in Christ is very similar. And so we have those crew chiefs that have our backs. And then we in turn are expected to also have our fellow warriors' backs as we go into combat. So the question we probably need to ask ourselves is, do we recognize those folks that have served us as crew chiefs in our mission in faith? And then are we serving others and giving back and being crew chiefs for others? So who helped you? You know, when we think about this, who helped you? Who oriented you in your faith? who helped you, who prayed behind the scenes, what community of believers taught you, motivated you, encouraged you in your faith. So, who hung out with you, as we talked about in past lessons on pulling G's, who hung out with you when the G forces were bearing down on you in life, who just was there for you, who showed up and who was who showed you what a real Christian was. And so these souls, these brothers and sisters, these are your crew chiefs. And so the question we ask is, would someone call you their crew chief? We think about it. The Apostle Paul was just a famous crew chief. So he actually started thousands, not maybe thousands, but he ended up launching so many churches in the beginning of the Church of Christ that he, was a massive crew chief. He taught in messages in his words. He lived it out in his faith. He served believers. He served unbelievers in Christ. He prayed countless hours for his brothers and sisters. He hung out with them. He worked with them side by side, and he encouraged them. And even when necessary, he corrected them. And so just a small example, obviously, of Paul's crew chief-like actions in serving. You can see in his words in the church, his letter to the church of Philippi, actually Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. He says, "I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it out to completion to the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart, and whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me." So that just gives you just a snapshot of the heart of Paul as a crew chief for Christ in those churches. So something else for crew chiefs and others is the crew chiefs are just kind of one specialty code, right? I mentioned all kinds of specialty codes and that cast of thousands of warriors working behind the scenes. So the Air Force actually calls them AFSCs, or Air Force Specialty Codes. And the different specialty codes like ammo, maintenance, logistics, fuel support, all those different codes, intelligence. So they have all these different specialty codes. Well, just like the Air Force and just like crew chiefs and all these other specialty codes, we actually sort of have something like that in our mission in faith, where God has given us actually a series of specialty codes and to serve both the church and the community around us. And so in Paul's letter to the Roman and Corinthian churches, so Romans 12, 6 through 8, and 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 11, he lists just some of these specialty codes. And there are much more, especially when we include talents. But these specialty codes are special codes actually for serving as crew chiefs and serving others in the community of believers. And so here's some he lists, and these are gifts of grace from God. He includes serving, interpreting the will of God, wisdom that God gives you, messages of knowledge, faith, just faith, teaching, encouraging, giving. Contributing to the needs of others, leadership, administration, and then just showing mercy. And so these are just some of the specialties that he gives us, and obviously there's many, many more. But one thing to keep in mind with all that is it's real easy for us to look at one specialty and say that's more important than the other. Man, preaching, teaching is much more important than giving, and we don't need to do that because I think God doesn't do that. God looks at each one as being equally important, and even some of the ones that we think are more important in our world are probably less important to God, and some of the ones that we think aren't as important are maybe more important to God. So we need to be careful, I think, when we start assigning priorities to different specialty codes. It'd be just like for flying fighters. If you said, well, fuels is not as important as flying fighters. Well, a fighter doesn't do anything. It doesn't get off the ground. It doesn't taxi. It doesn't do anything without the lifeblood of fuel. So each one is equally important in that whole mission. And so Paul actually compares it to our body, where one part isn't more important than the other. And he says in 1 Corinthians 12 through 26, he says, the body is one unit. Though it is made up of many parts, the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. So Paul says those words. So when we look at all this too, one of the things we often are left thinking about is what is the motivation as Christians, what is our motivation behind being a crew chief to our fellow Christians and believers, and what drives us and motivates to be crew chiefs that others may fly. So obviously for crew chiefs in the Air Force and other specialties, they're driven by the mission. They're driven by serving with a team, serving with their brothers and sisters. Sometimes it just feels like duty, and they're driven by their duty. But in our motivation for Christ to be Christian crew chiefs, to help others like that, there's another motivation really behind it all that we need to have. And what I'm referring to is what's called the L word. So not the L word you're thinking of, but the L word I'm talking about is the word love, Christian love. And I haven't talked much about this so far. I'm in the first 6 chapters. I haven't really even mentioned Christian love. And the reason is that the idea of the word love can be very uncomfortable to some people when we start out. And so, a lot of people go to church, and now for the first time they're seeing these songs and singing these songs that say, I'm so in love with you, Jesus, and all that. And many people have trouble identifying with that because they're not thinking of the correct kind of term of Christian love. They're thinking of different kinds of love, and it gets confusing for folks. So I thought I'd just kind of lead you through what real Christian love is supposed to be, what it says in the scriptures, and what should be our motivation as crew chiefs in serving other people. And so I don't want to put these kinds of questions in gender buckets, but basically, when you say the word love to men, typically, and a lot of other people, the first thing they think of is sexual love or sex. So men might think of that being the first thing. Obviously, they may think of, hey, I love my kids or whatever, but a lot of times that's the first thing that some folks think of when they mention love. When you mention love to a lot of females, and I don't mean all females by any means. Some males think of this too is a romantic love. They think of feelings of emotion, that emotional high. And so the Greek words for love, they have several different words to express love. They don't have the word just love. And I think they get closer to some of the real meaning of Christian love, and where you can kind of decipher that easier than in English, where we just have one word, love. And it can mean a multiple things. So sometimes we have to put something on top of it, like brotherly love. And we don't often do that. So that's why it's often confusing. So, and they have entire books to talk about love. And one of the things you'll notice if you go back and kind of research the Christian origins of the word love, you'll find that a lot of them are based on the word caritas, which I don't speak Greek, but in Greek and translated to English, it actually comes out to be charity. Is more of the love that they're talking about in Christian love. Now, when we think of charity, we just think of giving, that kind of thing. But what really charity means is love guided by principle. It can have feelings with it too, but it's love. It's a deep love guided by principle. And so I think that's more kind of where we're going with Christian love. And so if I were asked to kind of come up with a definition in English to clarify Christian love, I would probably say that it is an active, consistent, selfless concern for others that is independent of circumstances or feelings. And so an active, consistent, selfless concern for others that is independent of circumstances or feelings. And so when I say active there, I mean it's active. It bears itself out in actions. People do Christian love, charity. People do things for others. It's part of actions. It's part of what we do. It expresses itself in action. It's like a rock. Especially when I say the term active, consistent, I mean like a rock, actually. So consistent form of love, it means like a rock, consistent, always, never wavering. It's always there, kind of like the love often of a parent for a child. And then we talk about selfless concern for others. It's, is it truly selfless? Do you care, about them deeply? Does it more like a tough love? Like, for instance, real Christian love of this sort doesn't give an alcoholic a drink, right? That's suffering. So, it's more of a tough love that what's good for them. It's not about your selfish concerns, but about their concern, what's best for them overall. And then it's independent of circumstances or feelings. And that's hard because a lot of times, especially when we think of kind of gender buckets, it's easier for guys, I think, to kind of divorce ourselves of feelings at times. And we have an advantage and a disadvantage. So the advantage is we can kind of leave our feelings behind sometimes, and often have a little more ability to be consistent and not as kind of wavering ups and downs in our love for others and our concern for others and care. So for women, though, they have I think a distinct advantage in general. Again, I'm not putting gender buckets on here, but some people and women in particular often are more able to identify strongly with their emotions. So this, I think, gives them an ability, kind of a unique ability to be more intense and to bring that love to a greater high. I think the disadvantage with that is emotions tend to go up and down, right? We're never not quite as consistent. So that's probably a disadvantage with someone who's more tied to the emotional side of love versus the other side. So a couple other things is, I think if I was going to describe how real Christian love grows, I would probably use it in terms of how love grows and changes in a lasting long-term marriage. So when you talk to those people who've been married for 50 years, I've only been married 28 years, so I don't know as much as some of those people who've been married like 50 years. But I will say that love kind of changes some in its forms as you grow in your relationship and marriage. And so I think we start out more with an emotional love. They say your first 2 years of marriage are the kind of the infatuation stage, where it's based a lot on emotions and those feelings of the in love experience. And then they say, and I think the goal is after those first 2 years is to make sure your love has origins in and is transitioning to more of a deeper form of love, a more of deeper care form of love. And that doesn't mean that there aren't romantic feelings or any of that. That's great too, but I think the marriages that last are able to transition into that deeper form of love, of commitment, of that steady, active, abiding, selfless concern kind of love. And so I'm blessed in my marriage to have done that together. I know a lot of times my wife looks at me and says, man, her emotions probably are not feeling it at that day, but she continues to care for me, and we continue to grow in our love and our marriage, and I think that's important. So I think the book of Corinthians Paul really describes love in 1 Corinthians, and it's a famous chapter, the 13th chapter in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's called the love chapter, but he really describes what real Christian love is supposed to be. And so just for the sake of changing things up a little bit, I'm going to substitute the word charity in here, so folks can kind of repicture kind of where he's talking about real Christian love, because that in its original form, actually the word charity was used in this verse. It says, charity is patient, charity is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Charity does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Charity never fails. And now these three things remain: faith, hope, and charity. But the greatest of these is charity. So, man, what an awesome verse, and he pretty much summarizes it right there. And this is God's definition of love. This is God's definition of charity. And so, what motivates us to serve as crew chiefs to others, and to serve on the flight lines of faith? What motivates us is charity. It's God's love. It's real love. And so where do we learn this love? Where do we learn this, and where do we model this? We model it after our Creator. We model it after our Creator who gave us Christ. And so in John 3:16 it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So we care for others and we serve for others in this life because God first served and cared for us. God was our original crew chief, and we love because we follow in his footsteps. So I'd like you to check out the discussion questions, and thank you for joining me, and I look forward to chapter 8.